particular aspects. I'm going to read from a book by, I've always wanted to read something by Aleister Crowley while in a church, but I'm gonna find a really funny thing. He has a really sort of like dry writing style. At his very worst, he's like classist, not so much, but just he's really into himself and his level of accomplishment. That's all. But so he has some kind of like, he sometimes has like lofty things to say about himself as opposed to people who earn less in society. But let me find this. This is the introduction, not the preface. Okay. Oh yeah. Astrologers sometimes make mistakes. From this fact, which even they are scarcely sufficiently brazen to dispute, it follows with mathematical certainty that astrology is not a science, but a sham, a quackery, and a fraud. Contrast its shameful uncertainty with medicine, where no doctor ever lost a patient, with law, where no lawyer ever lost a case, or even with arms, where no soldier ever lost a battle. It is true that 9 times out of 10, an astrologer glancing at a stranger can tell at what hour of the day he was born. This must be guesswork, for we do not see how it is done or can be done. It is an obvious canon of all sound philosophy that unless we know exactly how things happen, we must deny that they do happen, or, if even philosophy cannot so far close eyes on an actuality, we must ascribe them to chance. Thought of this altitudinous brilliance as the guarantee of human progress. It reminds one of the sun rising over the crest of some mighty pyramid of rock and ice, crowned with the everlasting snows. True it is that in all cases, an astrologer in the front rank of his profession gives good advice, kind, shrewd, disinterested, and worldly wise, yet inspired by a diviner wisdom such as the fact that he spends his life in the contemplation of the noblest phenomena of nature, that the soul behind them cannot but operate to bestow. True also that any astrologer of eminence can point to hundreds of people whose life, honor, and property have been preserved through his advice. But what do these facts prove? What are we to think of any man who does not earn his living honestly, but by gambling on Wall Street, or faking antique furniture, or adulterating the food of the people, or wrecking railroads, or manufacturing the instruments of war? Why, the fellow is a cheat, a scoundrel. The idle wretch polishes off his daily evil in 18 hours to squander the remaining 6 in the hideous debauch of sleep. So yeah, that's the typical writing style of Crowley. He's a little bit unsure of himself, right? So let's find something else. He talks. That was the preface. Here's the general principles of astrology. He has some really interesting things to say about the planetary aspects. When the word aspect is used in astrology, it means entirely like the relationship between the position of one planet or celestial body with another. So, and also in astrology, the sun and the moon are considered planets. They refer to that out of convenience, but technically they're also called luminaries.
Can you give an example of an aspect? A simple example
Okay.
of an aspect?
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. In aspects, like the moon was in a sextile to Jupiter. Well, actually, okay, let's look at this. It was, but here's the constellation of Cancer, and the moon is in Virgo now. But any of the planets that are in Cancer, say if they were in the middle of Cancer, when the moon was in Virgo, it formed a sextile to Cancer, meaning it was 60 degrees away. A sextile means 60 degrees, and that would be an aspect. There are a few aspects that are considered more. Hey.
What does discrimination mean?
Just a Virgo, she seems
To discriminate, not like against, to discern, like to distinguish one thing from another. The modern motto of Virgo is actually "I serve." It's a very analytical sign, so by discriminate they mean to like analyze and like
To tell things apart
tell
from each
things
other.
apart from each other. Yeah. Okay, relate. Yeah. A lot of the lofty language that we put the names of the constellations in, as much as the planets' movements uphold the 12 different signs, those 12 signs embody 4 pillars of the psyche. And modern day psychology, unbeknownst to many people, comes straight from astrology. And in it, the 4 elements are represented as intuition, sensation, thinking, and feeling. Now, my original plan was to like not really talk about astrology that much, but to kind of lay the groundwork in a way that shows that it is actually a very empirical science. The thing is that it's also very artful. Now, one of the major crises of like the modern day human psyche is that people don't understand that the subjective and objective define each other. We tend to separate them, and basically, I'm going to emphasize three major relationships between the four aspects of the psyche. Now, I like this diamond, and it's literally, thanks to Alan, we have these things that I conceptualize some of them, but this is just typography. This is a psychological image. This is just a colored version of an image that represents the human psyche. But it makes a lot of sense because intuition is at the top. So if you think of like your visionary self, not just thinking with language, but the inner vision, the primordial image, so to speak. That is intuition. I like that thinking is on the left and feelings on the right because of the obvious left and right brain association, and then sensation for our bodies. Now, the energies of these four aspects, the four aspects of the psyche, is not a perfect diamond. This doesn't happen in our body like a perfect diamond. Do you know what I'm saying? I actually, on a chakra-based level, on an energetic level, I think of intuition as being not just the vision, but the heart center. In a lot of ways, the more internal elements, we'll get to that, intuition and feeling, they do meet a lot at your center. Then they represent willfulness and compassion. In a lot of ways, the objective ones, thinking and bodily sensation, are the most polarized because thinking almost entirely takes place up here and can actually override our internal vision, whereas like sensation is really the lower three chakras that a lot of people get stuck in. And so first, we're going to examine the classic duality of the psyche, and that is the masculine and feminine elements. Now, it's important to remember that our language is typically oriented around the external object. For example, the word cup is easier to define than the word love, because a cup is entirely external, and love involves both internal and external things. Now, I might say that both a cup and an act of love require receptivity. In fact, the cup's tarot suit represents emotion, but because cups are entirely an object, and love is a more internal, elusive thing, internal and external, everything external is therefore easier to define. So when we say elements are more masculine or feminine, that doesn't necessarily mean that they characterize men or women anymore. That means that the masculine ones are projective in nature, and the feminine ones are receptive in nature. Now, it is, in the words of Carl Jung, for example, it is no proof of the extroverted nature of thinking that my thinking is extroverted because I'm either abstracting my thought from the object or concretizing my thought through it. Does that make sense? So when you're looking at your sense perceptible world, sensation, you can abstract thought from what you're seeing, or you can actually be taking thoughts you already had and looking for them in what's going on around you. That's the difference between extroverted and introverted thinking. But thinking is still by nature extroverted. And here we go. It's really interesting because when you fold duality on itself, you get other relationships that contain both the masculine and the feminine within them. And some of those relationships have actually been pinned back on the original masculine-feminine duality, which is just not very productive. Although fire and air are the more masculine projective ones, and water and earth are the more feminine receptive ones, that doesn't mean that these are both external and these are both internal. Now, that's complicated. Just because this is extroverted doesn't mean it's purely external. And just because these are more introverted doesn't mean they're purely internal. That brings up, that brings up the next use of the yin and yang to describe it. And I might just keep that one up there so that you can see the difference. But this, in Jungian psychology, I'll be using his name a lot. I'll get back to that. In Jungian psychology, this is actually the main way that the yin-yang symbol is used to represent the four elements. And again, we think of yang as being more masculine and yin as being more inner and feminine. But we'll notice that both the inner and outer worlds here partake of both masculine and feminine. That's very important. This is to say that the primary principle of consciousness, yang, is directed out toward the more objective elements. And the primary principle of the internal, or the more unconscious, is directed in toward the more subjective elements. Is anyone with me so far on that? This is really important because it means that the conscious mind, which we associate with being rational and masculine, is actually oriented around equal parts masculine and feminine. And the internal mind, the internal world, which we associate with the feminine, is actually oriented around equal parts masculine and feminine, if we're going to keep using those words to distinguish things. You know what I'm saying? This is a pretty disturbing duality because it means that our conscious mind is oriented around the myth of permanence, the idea that things are unchanging. and the internal world is oriented around, it is very changing, subjective. Now, isn't it weird though, that like thinking, language, and sensation, like materials, although objective in nature, are actually what people fundamentally have the most different of? Our languages are different, our level of riches or our sense perception are different. And isn't it weird then that the subjective inner world of intuition and feeling is actually what we all most objectively fundamentally share? So that shows a really disturbing duality, and that's that like the conscious mind tends to be oriented around like the notion that things are permanent. A friend of mine and Alan said, when did language go from description to definition? And that's what I thought that was really profound, because language it kind of locks people into the belief that this is this, that is that. In a lot of ways, it'll seem like what I'm saying is sort of a denigration of like air and earth types. That's not the case.